The moment my body gave out at work, before the cold floor rose to claim me, I still believed collapse was something that happened to other people, those who hadn't learned to endure. I woke 3 days later under the hiss of machines, my chest bound by a pain that felt like retribution for years of swallowed exhaustion. The room was sterile, almost merciful in its quiet. My phone, once revived, was less forgiving. I expected worry. Instead, Emma's smiling face greeted me, tagged beneath a photo of my entire family lined up by a lakeshore. "Family day without the drama," her caption sang. The words burned hotter than the IV threading into my arm. I didn't respond, didn't break. I simply watched the likes multiply as if the world itself had voted to confirm what I already suspected. Somewhere along the way, family had stopped being love and become performance, curated, filtered, rehearsed. 4 days later, my screen erupted with 74 missed calls and a single text from Dad. "We need you." Strange how need can sound like a threat when you've spent a lifetime paying its price. Back then, I still believed dependability was a virtue. At Green Tech, where deadlines were the closest thing to oxygen, I was the one who stayed late, the one who delivered. Colleagues said my discipline bordered on frightening. They didn't know it wasn't ambition. It was survival. Every extra hour I worked helped refill the endless pit waiting for me at home, a pit shaped like obligation and dressed as love. Dad, now renamed Daniel in the family mythbook, had been between jobs since the market crash. 7 years of waiting for opportunity to knock while I covered the bills it had long abandoned. Mum, Stephanie, insisted he just needed time, but what he really needed was someone else's lifeline. Mine. Emma, our household self-appointed influencer, launched a new empire every month. Wellness, candles, podcasts, empires that died before they lived. My money patched the ruins, and Stephen, the youngest, the quiet borrower with the loud memory lapses, drifted through design school with pockets that mysteriously emptied themselves. Online, though, we were immaculate. Matching sweaters at winter, choreographed laughter, curated warmth. Emma posted us like trophies, captioning one photo, "The Varellos, proof that love is everything." She wrote that the same week I paid Mum's overdue car insurance and slipped the mortgage out of delinquency. Love apparently now issued invoices. Only Grandpa Samuel, now Brandon, ever noticed the arithmetic of our affection. 40 years as a law firm accountant taught him to recognize when numbers didn't add up. "You can't audit love," he once whispered, "but you'll feel the deficit." His gaze had lingered on me with something like warning. I ignored it. I'd been raised to believe loyalty could fix any fracture, even those carved into bone. So I kept fixing, patching, transferring, rescuing, because stopping felt dangerous. Because some part of me feared that no would finally reveal what my family thought I was worth. The night before the collapse, I was still at my desk at 10 p.m, blueprints swimming in and out of focus. A tightening in my chest pulsed like a fist demanding owed debts. I blamed stress. I blamed deadlines. I blamed everything except the truth. When I finally grabbed my laptop to leave, Emma's message lit the screen. "Can you cover my rent? Promise I'll pay you back next month." My fingers hovered, hesitating, rebelling. Then habit crushed rebellion. "Sure," I typed. That was the last thing I remember before gravity dragged me under. The hospital lights were blinding, too white, like they wanted to bleach the story of what brought me there. When consciousness finally settled, the world was a blur of ceiling tiles and IV lines. A nurse asked if I knew where I was. I didn't answer. I was too busy trying to reconstruct the missing hours, the missing days, the missing pieces of myself. The doctor, who entered later, spoke with clinical detachment. "Cardiac event. You're fortunate your coworker reacted quickly." Fortunate. Luck shouldn't be the reason someone stays alive. Love should have been. They told me they had called my emergency contacts, Daniel and Stephanie, but no one answered. "We left several messages," the nurse added, her voice careful, as if the truth might shatter what the machines were keeping together. Hours bled into one another. No footsteps, no familiar voices. just sunlight inching across the wall and retreating again. On the third day, the nurse handed me my fully charged phone. I knew I shouldn't look, but I did. The first notification wasn't from family. It was from a public account. "You've been tagged in a post." My fingers trembled as I opened it, bracing for impact. The image loaded slowly. Sunlight, water, smiling faces. The family I was dying to save, celebrating without the burden of me. And something inside me shifted. Quiet, precise, irrevocable. Not rage, not yet. Just the first pulse of unfinished business, rising from an old wound that had finally stopped pretending to heal. My family glowed from the screen, arranged around a picnic table like an advertisement for a life I was no longer invited to. Stephanie, with her deviled eggs held up like an offering. Daniel gripping a beer as if it were an anchor. Stephen throwing up peace signs beside Emma, whose caption pulsed beneath their perfect faces. Family day without the drama. For a second, air refused to enter my lungs. The monitor at my bedside spiked, each frantic beep echoing the sudden acceleration in my veins. It would have been funny if it hadn't been mine. My erasure, documented and posted. A celebration of family, curated on the same day their emergency contact lay wired to machines. They hadn't just left me, they had edited me out. I zoomed in on their smiles, relaxed, sunlit, untouched by guilt. No strained expressions, no red eyes, no sign of absence. Just a cleaner composition now that the problem, me, had been cropped out. A nurse passed by and paused. "Do you need anything?" she asked softly. "No," I said, the word brittle and precise. "I think I've had enough." I didn't comment, didn't call, didn't send a single message. I just stared until the phone dimmed and my reflection surfaced over their happiness, washed out, hollow-eyed but oddly steady. Not the serenity people talk about in healing stories. This was something colder, a calm born from clarity, from finally seeing the ledger without excuses. By the fourth day, I was walking again, slow and shaky, dragging the IV pole behind me like a reluctant witness. The doctor talked about weeks of recovery, careful monitoring, lifestyle changes. He didn't realize the fracture wasn't only in my chest. Something in the architecture of my loyalty had snapped clean through. Then, one morning, my phone lit up as if on fire. Calls stacked over each other. 74 missed. One message from Daniel. "We need you. Answer immediately." "No. How are you? No. Where are you? No. I'm sorry. Just urgency, command." Panic dressed as concern. I read it twice, each pass peeling back another layer of absurdity. When I'd needed them, there'd been silence and sunlight on a lakeshore. Now that some unseen crisis threatened their comfort, I was summoned like an emergency fund, with a beating heart. I didn't call back. Not this time. Instead, I scrolled to another name. Brandon. The only contact that didn't feel like a transaction. My thumb hovered for a heartbeat, then pressed. He answered on the second ring. "You don't have to explain," he said quietly. Just that. No questions. No demands. A door opening instead of another bill. 40 minutes later, he appeared in the doorway of my room, wearing his old brown windbreaker and that measured, unreadable expression that had seen more ledgers than confessions. He didn't hug me. He never did. He simply sat beside the bed, like he'd been holding the chair in reserve for years. "So," he said, eyes flicking to the monitor, "they finally broke you, huh?" A ghost of a smile tugged at my mouth. "Looks like it." He didn't ask what happened. Brandon collected facts differently, letting silence do the sorting. He spent the day speaking with the nurse, checking that my insurance was doing the bare minimum of its job. When the billing clerk mentioned outstanding charges, he didn't sigh, didn't scold. He pulled out his tablet and opened a fresh sheet. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Taking stock," he replied. "Before you cut cords, you need to know where they all lead." We went through everything. My checking balances, automatic transfers, the car insurance I'd taken on just for a little while, the joint credit card lines. With every item, my stomach twisted tighter. money bleeding out in quiet, obedient drips. Emma's loan, Stephen's rent, Mum's car, utilities for a house I hadn't lived in since college. A financial map of every time I'd confused surrender with care. "How did I let this happen?" I whispered. "You thought it was love," Brandon said. "They thought it was obligation." He tilted his head. "Different math." That night, as the machines hummed and the hallway lights dimmed, he showed me how to shut the flows down one by one. Not as revenge, he insisted, but as survival. Still, the act carried its own quiet promise of justice. He drafted a spreadsheet, every recurring charge listed like a confession, and handed it to me as if he were placing a key in my palm. "Tomorrow," he said, standing, "we start with the bank." I barely slept. The image of that picnic photo kept replaying behind my eyelids. Their smiles, the bright water, the caption that cut deeper than any diagnosis. Over it all, the faint beeping of the monitor tapped out a rhythm that felt less like monitoring and more like a countdown. The next morning, I called the bank from my hospital bed. The clerk recognized my name, her tone warm with the habit of trusting me to fix things. By noon, the auto-transfers were gone. Emma's silent siphon cancelled. Stephen's rent pipeline sealed. Mum's insurance removed from my account. Each confirmation click felt like air filling a space that had been caving in for years. It wasn't triumph. Not yet. But it was the first breath that didn't hurt. By evening, the messages began. From Stephanie. "We just heard what happened. Why didn't you tell us?" From Stephen. "Can we talk? It's all a misunderstanding." I let the screen light up and fade, light up and fade, their words stacking uselessly against the new, unfamiliar stillness inside me. Brandon sat in the corner with a newspaper, turning pages slowly, pretending not to notice my phone vibrating on the tray. "You feel guilty yet?" he asked eventually, not looking up. "Yeah," I exhaled. "A little." "That'll pass," he said, folding the paper. "Guilt's the tax good people pay before freedom." The next day, I signed the discharge papers. No dramatic farewell, no last-minute rush of reconciliation. Brandon drove me home in silence, the city sliding past the window. With every mile, the cords they'd wrapped around my life loosened, thread by invisible thread, leaving behind not emptiness, but space, wide, unfamiliar, and waiting for whatever came after the reckoning. The apartment felt tighter the moment I stepped inside, as if the walls had inched closer in my absence, eager to overhear the fallout. I muted my phone, unplugged it completely, and stood by the window until the city lights blurred into a smear. For a few blessed minutes there was nothing. Then a muted vibration on the table. Another message from Daniel. "This is serious. Call me now." Everything is falling apart. A strange, fleeting sympathy brushed my mind, thin as smoke. But sympathy requires innocence, and none of them had been innocent for a long time. They confused my silence with compliance. They didn't understand that silence can be the first sound of a door locking from the inside. 2 days later, I was back in Brandon's one-story Portland house, the place that always smelled faintly of roasted coffee and the patience of old wood. He'd transformed the dining table into a battlefield, papers arranged in careful rows under a slant of afternoon light. Bank records, insurance letters, transfer logs, years of quiet depletion laid out between us like the anatomy of a long, slow betrayal. "Every life leaves a trail," Brandon said, tapping one of the stacks. "Yours just happens to be financial." By the time we reached the bottom of the final pile, the truth had sharpened into a solid shape. I hadn't supported them. I had underwritten their comforts. Without my paycheck, the glossy Varello image, the curated stability, the illusion of control, it all crumbled instantly. And crumble it did. The calls multiplied. My voicemail filled with Stephanie's polished concern. "Susan, sweetheart, we didn't know you were in the hospital. Why didn't you tell us sooner?" A pause. A softer, carefully injured tone. "Your father's anxious about the mortgage." Anxious, not remorseful, not worried about me, worried about the house. Then came Emma's barrage, empty accounts, dramatic emojis, and finally, "If you don't fix this, I'll lose everything." I stared at her message until my irritation cooled into something crystalline. I replied with one word: "Good." Stephen tried next. "I'm not like them. Don't punish me for what they did." But she'd whispered the same plea when I co-signed her lease last year. Another promise with no intention of lifespan. Brandon watched me absorb it all, his expression unreadable. "They're not reaching out because they're worried about you," he said. "They're reaching out because their safety net's gone." The truth settled with a weight that felt almost liberating. The next morning, a car idled outside my building. Daniel sat behind the wheel, staring up at my window with the blank patience of someone used to collecting debts in person. He didn't call, didn't knock, just waited, assuming guilt would pull me downstairs. I didn't move. Later, a new text arrived. "You're about to destroy everything we built. I hope you understand the damage you're causing. Everything we built." I read it aloud, letting the irony roll on my tongue. When I showed it to Brandon, he chuckled once, dry and humourless. That sentence tells you exactly how he's rewritten the story in his head. Then came the inevitable escalation. Emma posted a video that evening, a melancholic tour of our childhood home, lights off, walls bare. Her voice wavered theatrically as she explained how everything had been taken. Then, a dramatic cut to an old Christmas photo of me, cropped and framed as the villain. Caption: "Sometimes blood isn't family." The comments detonated instantly. Strangers called me heartless. Influencers reposted her sob story. My inbox filled with messages from people who knew nothing, but felt entitled to judge. Brandon watched the entire video, jaw tight. When it ended, he lifted his phone and made 3 decisive calls. Within 48 hours, we had the documents that mattered: equity withdrawals, default notices, late fee summaries. They had drained the house, not for survival, but to patch Emma's credit and Stephen's failed candle studio that never opened a single day. I didn't have to expose them. The numbers told the story without embellishment. Still, we filed a fraud report. Brandon and his lawyer, Mr. Dennis, drafted a cease and desist. No contact, no financial requests, no impersonation. We mailed one to each of them, the signatures ink-shed under fluorescent lights. That night, I slept like someone who had finally stepped out of a trap. By morning, the inevitable backlash arrived. The phone vibrated nonstop. When I glanced through the peephole, Stephen was downstairs at the entrance, heatedly arguing with building security. Her name wasn't on the visitor list anymore. For the first time in years, the boundary was mine. From my window, I watched Stephen pacing below, phone pressed to her ear, her free hand slicing the air in frantic little gestures. She was probably calling Emma, rehearsing a new version of the truth. I didn't go down. I didn't even move. Later that afternoon, Brandon arrived, his windbreaker damp from the Portland drizzle, a thick manila envelope tucked beneath his arm. "They've stepped into dangerous territory," he said as he handed it over. Inside were printed email threads between my parents and a local law firm. Something in the ink itself felt sour. I scanned the top page once, then again, the words rearranging themselves into a familiar pattern of coercion. Emergency petition for temporary conservatorship. I read the header aloud, disbelief flattening my voice. Brandon sighed. "They tried the same tactic with your uncle. It didn't fly then, and it wasn't going to fly now either." He was right. Their attempt was already dead. The trust Brandon helped me establish had sealed most of my finances beyond their reach. My doctor's statements verified my cognitive stability. HR had confirmed I was on medical leave, not spiralling into unemployment. By the time their paperwork hit the courthouse, ours had beaten it there. Their motion died the moment it arrived. But they didn't retreat. They never did. That evening, Emma posted another video, her face streaked with mascara, tears arranged like props. "Mental illness doesn't always look the way you expect," she murmured to the camera. "Sometimes the people you love push you away. We're only trying to help her before it's too late." Her followers swarmed with sympathy. Praying for Susan trended, but the internet is fickle and cruel in equal measure. Someone resurfaced her old family day without the drama post and stitched it beside her crying confession. Where was that concern when she was in the hospital? The caption sliced her narrative clean open. Then the tide turned. Screenshots appeared. Emma's brand deals during the week I was unconscious. Her smug tweets about toxic siblings. Stephen's Etsy shop flooded with strangers asking uncomfortable questions. Daniel's brokerage clients withdrew their accounts. Stephanie's Facebook filled with comments demanding explanations. By Friday, their online empire had imploded, faster than their finances ever had. Brandon handed me his coffee mug, his expression dry. "You didn't lift a finger," he said. "The truth handled the heavy work." That night, a single text arrived from my mother. "Please, can we talk?" I stared at the message, thumb hovering. Then I turned the phone face down on the table and left it to suffocate in the dark. Across the room, Brandon looked up. "You holding up?" "Yeah," I whispered. "I'm just done." But the Varellos weren't. The next morning, a courier knocked on the door with another envelope, this one addressed in my father's handwriting. Inside lay a newly drafted will. The ink trembled across the page. "In the event of my death, all assets go to the remaining family who maintain unity. Susan is disinherited until she reconciles." I laughed. Quiet, startled laughter. It was the same manipulation, only dressed up in legal formality. "They still think I'm chasing money," I said, handing it to Brandon. He shook his head. "They've never met someone willing to walk away from the bait." That evening, I wrote my final response. Not a text, not a message, not something they could twist or screenshot. My attorney sent it formally. A waiver of all rights to the estate, paired with a request for permanent no contact. I signed it without hesitation, sealed the envelope, and placed it in Brandon's hands. "File it Monday." He nodded. "What comes next?" Outside, rain streaked down the window, thinning into clear lines as the storm began to wane. "I think I'll rest," I said, "somewhere quieter." For the first time in years, the words didn't feel borrowed or aspirational. They felt true. 2 weeks later, the rain finally gave up. Brandon and I packed the only things that mattered: one suitcase, my laptop, a few photos untouched by fabrication. Then we drove east toward Colorado. Brandon said he wanted to see the mountains again before winter settled in. I didn't argue. I just watched the highway unspool ahead of us, mile after mile of quiet I hadn't realized I'd been craving. The cabin we rented perched near a ridge lined with towering pines. No noise, no expectations, no family, just honest silence. I worked remotely for Green Tech. Fewer hours now, with weight finally lifted off my chest. Mornings started with bitter black coffee. Evenings ended with the wind scraping across the roof like a distant reminder of a world I no longer belonged to. Messages still slip through sometimes. Curious cousins, strangers who devoured the online drama, people eager for explanations. I never replied. They could believe whatever version made sense to them. My truth didn't require an audience anymore. Brandon often sat by the cabin window in the mornings, a newspaper open but barely read, stealing quiet glances at me as though measuring the change in my breathing. One day he lowered the page and said, in that calm, matter-of-fact way of his, "You did it. You cut the cord." I let out a small smile. "It only cost everything." He huffed a soft laugh. "Then consider yourself lucky. That's the discount." And he wasn't wrong, because what I gained was worth more than every apology they never offered, every inheritance dangled like a leash, every staged family portrait meant to hide what was cracking underneath. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the provider, the repair crew, or the daughter drafted into emotional debt. I was just Susan, alive, untethered, and finally my own. I once believed silence meant surrender, that turning my back meant losing. But I learned silence can be deliberate, an act of self-protection, a boundary written in air instead of ink, a peace that belongs only to you. My family still tests that boundary through others, distant relatives, old neighbours, people who message under the guise of concern, tiny probes checking if I'll respond, if I'll cave, if I'll return to the role they carved out for me. I never do. Some stories don't need redemption arcs. Some simply need to stop before they consume what's left of you. If you've ever been branded selfish for choosing yourself, I hope you remember this. Survival isn't betrayal. Peace is not abandonment. And freedom is not a crime. They can keep their curated sadness, their pity posts, their rewritten memories. I'll keep my quiet mornings, my unforced laughter, the life I rebuilt from the bones of the old one. And if you've ever had to walk away from your own blood to heal, your story belongs here too.